This is another in the series of videos on Chinese religious tradition. You can watch them in any order you want to, but you do want to make sure you watch them all. This particular one will give us something of a sweep of Chinese religious history. It's not like the kind of history lecture where you're going to get a lot of dates and names and battles and all of that stuff, but you do want to get some idea how we get from the beginning to a very religiously diverse China today. And China is a very religiously diverse place. It's a big place. There are 1 billion people living in a country that's slightly smaller than the continental United States. And in that space where everybody's packed in, anywhere from 180 to 350 million are practicing Buddhists. 150 to 250 million people are practicing Taoists. You've got probably 50 million or so Christians. You've got something like 20, 30 million or so Muslims, and a whole lot of smaller religions as well, all in an officially atheist state. So how did China get to this place? Well, China not only is a big place, it's an old place. It's one of the 3 great starting civilizations. The other 2, of course, are the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and over here, the Chinese. And so somewhere back about 4,000 years ago, they began to form up to get to a place where they would be a civilization. And by about 3,700 years ago or so, the first of China's dynasties had been formed up. We are talking the kind of government that is now going to last for 3,650 years. It's an incredibly long stretch of stability. But that doesn't mean it's all the same in there. The original dynasty, the Shang dynasty, we know very little about. Recently they've come up with some new archaeological pieces which can make for some interesting insight. But as far as our course is concerned, not much is going to happen for China's religious tradition until we get to about the middle of the 1000s BCE, 3,000 years ago. Now, up until this point, people practiced folk traditions. And you'll know folk traditions if you read the textbook. You'll see there's a description of feng shui, which is all about arranging things so that the energy flows through them in your household, so that your windows open up onto something bright and not the neighbor's wall, that sort of thing, in order for energy to flow through. It's all about energy flow. And the Chinese healing arts system and the nutrition system is all about making energy flow through us. That was being put into practice thousands of years ago. And you're going to get other things like divination. There's a flow of energy in the cosmos, and you just want to be able to know how to read it. And so 3,500 years ago, shamans were taking the shoulder bones of animals or turtle shells, and they would write Chinese characters on them, and then they'd throw them into the fire and wait for it to go crack. And they'd pick it up and they'd look to see how the lines all lined up, which things got connected together, and they'd be able to tell you something about who you are and what's going to happen to you. In the same way, people began looking up at the stars, and astrology becomes a deeply ingrained piece in China's religious tradition. So all of these things, they're religious practices because they see a weave in the cosmos, and they're seeking to live within that weave. You see, this is the problem. We tend to think of religion as all about God in the West. But you've got to think of religion as more connecting to. Religare is possibly from the word that means to reconnect. And so religion connects you to the cosmos that we live in, perhaps. It can connect you to a God too, but not always. So China had a religious tradition. It just wasn't an official thing run by an institution until we get to about the middle of the 1000s BCE. That's when a new dynasty comes to town, the Zhao dynasty. And now the Zhao emperor, he's in an awkward position. He's got to be able to explain why it's okay for him to be the emperor instead of the guys that were in town before. And so the court comes up with an explanation called the mandate of heaven, which is to say, God put me here. Although the word God isn't the one that's used. Very rarely do you hear the word God. You hear heaven. Heaven is the ultimate in Chinese tradition. So heaven places the emperor here to connect that with what's down below. And then the emperor has a responsibility to maintain that relationship. And as long as he maintains that relationship properly, then good things will happen. The people will be protected, the harvests will come, and all of this. So the emperor, put into place, maintains the system. And if the system ever falls apart, if the harvests begin to fail, if the enemy starts pounding at the gates and you start losing battles, the other side of the mandate of heaven is yank, somebody else can take it right away. And that's what's going to happen to the Zhao dynasty. And about 275 years into the show, in the 770s or so, things begin to fall apart. The central power, the emperor, ceases to hold on to it all, and poof, power disseminates to the outer edges. Now power is in a lot of separate little city kingdoms. And so far we're holding together still as an emperor. He's going to be able to hold on for some time. Well, not he, the descendants are going to be able to hold on for some time, but with little power. And so things are happening on the edges, and then you get to a place in the middle of the 500s where people begin to fight against one another. These individual little kingdoms out there begin to try to assert themselves one over another. And this begins the Warring States period. Well, that's just about the same time that a guy named Confucius comes along. Confucius. And Confucius, he's a frustrated teacher. He wants to be a big name in the teaching world. He never quite makes it. He has a few good jobs that they don't go well. In fact, it's probably his personality, quite frankly. He didn't have the nicest personality on the planet, but he had a cool system. And his system insisted that if we would just have certain sort of protocols in life, 5 kinds of relationships should define us. And if we live according to those relationships, if every single one of us seeks to live our lives in those relationships, and not because they're rules, but because of the heart, the one who works to desire those relationships, if we can all nurture that along, society will all pull back together. The 5 relationships are between the emperor and the citizen, are between the father and the son, between the older brother and the younger brother, between the superior friend and the younger friend, and between the husband and the wife. In each case, the one above has responsibilities to the one below, who has responsibilities to the one above. And as long as people learn to live those relationships, everybody fulfilling their responsibility, it'll all fall into place. Well, he tries to teach this and nobody wants to listen. And so China plunges headlong into this Warring States era. And it's ugly for a couple of 100 years. During that same time frame, as sometime after Confucius, probably towards the end of the Warring States period, comes another guy. Or we think there was another guy. His name is Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu may or may not have been a real person, but somebody put a book together. And the book is called the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching is an alternative response to the Warring States problem. It isn't all about everybody living according to certain predefined sets of rules, whether you like it or you don't. It's about the weave of energy that runs through the cosmos. And the truly good emperor, Lao Tzu is arguing, is the one who figures out what that energy flow in the cosmos is. And instead of trying to make it in his image, he makes his emperorness in the image of the energy flow. In other words, it's not the ideas he brings and imposes upon people, like the 5 relationships. It's learning the lay of the land and then being able to point to it and telling people, hey, here's the lay of the land. Let's live our lives like that. So 2 very different ways. You might think of one of them as Confucius is more like a conservative in America who wants to hold on to the good ways of doing things. And Lao Tzu, I'm not going to make him out to be the Democrat. I'm going to make Lao Tzu out to be the libertarian. The libertarian who says, as long as we can figure out how the flow goes, we're in good shape. Well, neither one of them catches on fire right away. And the Qin dynasty begins to win the Warring States period and has no interest whatsoever in either Confucius or Lao Tzu, but makes a China. Qin becomes China. But the Qin dynasty doesn't last very long, and it's the next dynasty who begins to put it together, the Han dynasty. And the Han dynasty creates the first of what will be an enduring Chinese emperors. And the Han dynasty in the middle of the 100s looks and sees both Confucius and Taoism and says, these can work for us. And so we begin to see the implementation of these 2 religious traditions in some kind of tandem together. There's a third guy that comes along, of course, and his name is Shuangzi. And Shuangzi is a Taoist too. He knows Lao Tzu's stuff. But the Shuangzi, the book is named for him, the Shuangzi argues, don't even mess with politics, man. It's like, no matter what you do, you're beating your head against the wall. So just sort of check out of the whole thing. The truly wise one is the one who says, I don't want to play the game. I want to live off the grid. You know, people like that around too, huh? So Shuangzi's arguing that it's an individual's quest to learn to live according to the energy flow. Well, now we get that, and about the year 100 along comes Buddhism from the south, from India, and moves its way into China. And these three religious traditions, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, very quickly learn to live together. Now there'll be times over the course of the next few hundred years that an emperor will favor one over the others. But pretty soon we settle into a time frame where the average Chinese person sees that they capture all of that folk tradition that was there before and give it a framework. When the three are working together, it works the best for China. For the most part, that's Chinese religion. Until we get to about the year 1500 or so, when you get the people from the outside who begin to bring Christianity in. And they begin to challenge what's going to happen, because their Christianity asks questions and offers critiques that Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism had never expected or anticipated. And so you're going to see some assault on the traditions from Christianity, but you're also going to see some people within those three traditions begin to adapt them. So, for instance, the Taipei Rebellion in the 1800s is run by a guy who claims to be Jesus' little brother. Well, whatever. All of this flows along until we get to the Republican era. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize it, but China in the early 1900s voted out its emperor. For the first time in 3,600 years, it didn't have an emperor. The communists didn't end the emperor. An election ended the emperor. But that republic didn't last very long. And before you know it, China was thrown into a civil war. And the civil war between the two sides was eventually won by the communists, and that's Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong didn't like religion at all. And in fact, when he got to the 1960s, he won in 1949, made China an officially communist state and an officially atheist state. But it wasn't until the 1960s, when it didn't look like anything he had offered was really working, that he turned his sights on religion. And in what's called the Cultural Revolution, he outlawed all religion. And it was an ugly mess for just a very short time. We all might want to be very thankful that Chairman Mao died when he did. Today, China is officially still an atheist state, but recognizes the right of certain religious traditions to practice their ways. As long as they're registered with the government and they don't practice any kind of insurrection, the Chinese government's pretty good with all of that. There is some suspicion, and sometimes Christians are persecuted, and sometimes Buddhists are persecuted, and sometimes Muslims are persecuted. But overall, the situation is infinitely better than it was 50 years ago. That ought to get us for a while.